when I was thinking of this paper, I actually just wanted to say that the sequencing is very good, because after power and law comes something that trumps both power and law, human rights, and try to explain that. But when I was thinking of this, as a visioning exercise, I was thinking if we looked at where we are today as a country in terms of the institutional setup and the vibrant civil society and so on, do we really have to wait until 2047 to realize the human rights of everybody? And I actually don't think we do. So let's just try that exercise. I was thinking of somebody coming to India from, I don't know, Micronesia or Tuvalu, meeting a very positive, optimistic person like me at India International Center and asking, so what is this country, India? And what is the history of the country, and what is it now? And what are the institutions? How does it function as a democracy? And so you would start talking to them about freedom struggle, that it was based on human rights. You would tell them about the remarkable constitution we have, which has very strong protection of as fundamental rights, civil and political rights, and directive principles which have later on been interpreted by the Supreme Court as fundamental rights, education, safe, healthy environment, work, livelihood, housing, and so on. And then a comprehensive legislative framework which is underpinned by a whole range of institutions, independent institutions that very few countries, if any, have across the world. CAG, Election Commission, we have National Human Rights Commissions on a range of issues. We have 23 state human rights commissions. And then we have a civil society that is probably more vibrant than anywhere in the world, and a civil society that has actually over the years included some absolutely remarkable campaigns on human rights. The Right to Food campaign, the Right to Information campaign, the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, campaigns, the disabled, a very successful campaign on the rights of hawkers, and we have national civil society movements. There's UCL, UDR, there's something called the Working Group on Human Rights in India and the UN, which came into being 5 years ago, bringing together 15 of the main human rights organizations. People started working across sectors. And then of course we have what we've been discussing the last 2 days, this historical narrative of civilization, which has largely been based on tolerance, non-violence, multi-religious harmony and all that. So it sounds really very positive, but then you're having this coffee with someone from Tuvalu at India International Center, and Vijay Pratapji or any one of us in our rooms walks by and says, but wait a second, that's not the whole story. And the story, if you look at reality, is horrific. We have, I don't want to go into details, this will be in my paper, but we have some of the worst statistics on human rights violations in the world. Some are actually worse than countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We have 2 women are raped every 60 minutes. A young woman is found beaten to death, burned or driven to suicide every 6 hours. We have, draconian laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, arbitrary excessive force, extrajudicial summary executions, torture. We have India's share of child deaths is 20% of the world's. Approximately 1.8 million children die before their 5th birthday. Causes are, range of respiratory diseases, waterborne diseases, malaria, parasitic infections, and so on. And we have, what we haven't talked about at all, the colossal negative impact of evictions and displacement. There's figures that say 60 million, 1 million every year from development and distress migration. And then you have urban evictions, which few people are following, but a recent study shows that just from 2010 to 2015, around 240,000 people have been evicted in our cities around the world. So that's that's the reality. And there are a range of, I mean, why is it? It's a very pertinent question to ask, that when we have the institutional framework, when we have the vibrant civil society, when we have a free press, why are we in a situation, considering our human rights, if you look at the data and the range of it, why are we in much worse situation than many countries that are not democratic, that have authoritarian regimes, that have, military dictatorships and so on, including in our own region. And so the question that comes is, so if we have all these elements already and we're projecting ahead, what is it that is missing? And obviously what is missing is a much more rigorous approach of human rights. And here I want to talk about human rights not as a legal issue, of course it's a legal issue, but as something that has very strong moral and ethical dimensions. And I'll just speak on one principle of human rights which is very relevant, and we've been discussing that the last few days, which is the principle of self-determination. Essentially meaning that people in local areas have the first right of use of their natural resources. It means that people have, even states would have, or even at a very local level, people would have the right to internal autonomy. I think what Nyango and others were talking about is it's exactly that. And we've had situations where obviously the law has been used, like the Forest Rights Act, which you referred to, but cases like Niamgiri, where people have actually really used that to the full extent, this whole notion of self-determination. And then the second aspect that would be needed, of course, is a much more rigorous use of the United Nations human rights system. We have a situation now where there are hundreds of groups around the country working on women's rights, children's rights, a range of other rights, who are actually using the independent, very transparent part of the UN system, including something called the Universal Periodic Review, where all countries are being reviewed for their human rights. And I think that we somehow haven't focused enough in the country on that. Whenever there's a discussion on globalization, it's always about the WTO, or it's about the IMF or the World Bank, or even parts of the UN, like the Security Council and so on. But the positive, empowering parts of the UN, we're beginning to use more and more, but much more can be done. And so when you think ahead, it's, you can actually visualize, given the right conditions, that India would become a responsible member of the United Nations, that it would not become a member that promotes its economic or military power, but that actually is projecting and promoting its achievements on human rights and social justice, which are many. We've been hearing about so many examples over the last few days. So I think that this moment, the last few days, if I can just dream a little bit. If somebody writes the history of India, they would say, well, this meeting took place in CSDS, this period in 2016, and was actually a spark of a seminal moment in the history of the country. That we came together, and a bunch of anti-nationals, post-nationals, neo-national, sub-national, whatever, and actually came together and tried to work out a synthesis, that somebody used the word this morning, where we brought together the principles of environmental justice. You have that note which talks about subsidiarity, precautionary principle, and we brought them together with the very empowering principles of human rights, non-discrimination, non-retrogression, which means if a society has progressed to a certain level, you cannot go back on those achievements, gender equality, the right to a remedy, like you were talking about, in a much broader sense, of course, much beyond the courts. And we brought that together, and then we worked towards developing new rights, or filling in rights that are there, the right to social security, which means social security for everyone, not just people who are working. And we use all that to strengthen democracy, accountability mechanisms, the whole issue of free, prior, informed consent, and we provided, I don't know, maybe a new theory that was based on the dignity of the individual, the collective identity of the community, and the sanctity of nature. Thank you.
Your paper, have you reflected on the nature of human rights organizations? Because PUDR has a worldview which is basically inspired by Mao, Marx, etc. And PUCL, formally launched by JP and democratic people believing in non-violence, but both organizations and then similar ones at the state level, they are not talking about human rights the way you have talked about right to food, water, dignity, etc. They are defending the rights of only the activists who are working among the poor. So there is no real human rights organization in this country. That's one. And second, the vernacular and the globally connected divide is so much that organizationally, logistically, it's almost unviable for the Bharat to participate and create their own human rights organization, because they pertain to Bharat more than they pertain to India. And the existing human rights organization basically protect the Indians against human rights violation and do not have even inkling of the grassroots human rights violation which happen every day. Dalit atrocities, women discrimination, minority discrimination, Muslims not getting rented house, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I'm just going to add a bit to Vijay's question, that has not the human rights movement in India been handicapped by a kind of class bias? Actually, while this is true, what he's saying, it's also true that since much of the human rights or civil liberties groups have been oriented towards at least the theory of protecting the underprivileged, we have failed to build a cross-class civil liberties movement. And that is, I think, my greatest fear now about the present and the future. So, for example, see, when somebody is an upper middle class or even a rich person and their house is raided by the IT, the income tax, because somebody has a political vendetta to settle against that person, that is a civil liberty violation. But we have never allowed ourselves to take that view of civil liberties, and now it is, in some ways, maybe this kind of vicious anger that we are seeing in a segment of the middle class is maybe a consequence of the fact that we have never been able to broad-base the idea that civil liberties are a cross-class, cross-caste commitment that we must cultivate, and without which you can't have a functioning democracy. An unbiased application of the rule of law and the sense of fairness being upheld for all.
Maybe linking to what Vijay and Rajni just said, and then another point. Who is a human rights organization also, I think, needs to be. This is a question we've been asking: who is an environmental organization? The Adivasi, the what is. So, or which is. An Adivasi group fighting for their rights to the forests is actually also an environmental movement and is also a human rights movement. So I think one needs to look at it from, so I think when we say human rights organizations are PUC and PUDR, one needs to significantly expand the ambit and say, no, but there's much more. These are the more visible ones here, who call themselves with a name which actually has civil rights or democratic rights or human rights in it, but otherwise, of course, there are so many more who don't call themselves that. That's one.
But that's not recognized.
And exactly. And the same with the environmental thing, that they, of course, are also environmental movements, but are not necessarily recognized as such. Second one, Miloon, is I completely agree that I think we've been very weak at using the progressive, the UN frameworks on all fronts, human rights, environment, etc. But I'm also wondering whether, this is a question that we also pose to Professor Dubey, who's written the paper on India's role in the global, in the global future is whether the UN itself is an adequate system anymore, or whether it ever was. So if one is trying to also, let's say, protect human rights, let's say the rights of indigenous peoples, or the rights of communities, or fisher folk, or pastoralists, or whatever, and the fact that in order to actually access the UN or influence the UN, they still have to, I mean, they can access directly, but the decision making at the UN is still with the nation state. And if, as we are beginning to contest even the notion of the nation state in the last 2.5 days, then whether we actually need to move towards a global system beyond the UN, which has a greater ability to secure human rights than does the UN, because the UN still unfortunately has to work through nation states, and nation states themselves are violating human rights.
There are two things which it's worth remembering in this context that Gandhi mentions in Hind Swaraj, or claims or says. One is that he would not like his ideal utopian society to have doctors or lawyers. And these are not rash statements at all. These are extremely sober, considered statements. The other is when he talks about modern civilization and says that this civilization is so destructive that you don't have to do anything to bring it down, it will come down anyway. Now, at that time, modern civilization is still seeing it on another shore. It's not being imported here. My question to you, and this links with what Ashish just said very much. You see, we always close the door when the horse has just bolted. And the UN Declaration of Human Rights came, if you recall, in the wake of the Holocaust in the 1940s. Now, if you look at development in its totality, as it's been executed, and I use that word very precisely, the way the World Bank has executed development since 1944, unless we have the heart and the mind to imagine and envision a future in which the causes, some of the primary causes for the violations of human rights are not addressed, then we might as well live with the present. I mean, what I'm saying is that one needs to be able to imagine a future drawn from a well-imagined future in the past, for instance, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, in which a certain process which structurally violates human rights or prompts the violation of human rights in a systematic way in many contexts. For instance, the more pressure for growth, the more competition, the more workers are overworked, it puts pressure on them to be abusive at home, etc. They're very indirect consequences of development too. So, both in terms of positive human rights as well as negative human rights, is there a way we can think, is there a way we can imagine a future in which the very idea of human rights, or for that matter the law, is relegated to an exceptional status rather than being needed in the norm?
However, there is one thing that this would not take care of, which are the kinds of realities that have been pointed out both in the two papers on power and what Vijay just said, that there are ingrained forms of violence and structural violence in many societies that pre-exist the 20th century additional burdens that were created because of the push for development, etc. So there's it wouldn't take care of everything.
Mine is actually a small part clarificatory question in terms of the conceptual thing of human rights, and following partly from Vijay's thing, because this democratic rights, civil liberties, which is directed against violation of certain liberties by the state, is one thing. And that has to do, in a sense, with citizenship rights which are conferred by the state. Human rights, as its genesis also, the genesis of the term itself implies, is something which is not addressed to the state or by a state in particular, because you're actually thinking of human as a category which transcends of human being. But the question that part, you can say part frivolous but part not, is what is human about human rights? The violation, or is there something inherent? After all, animals don't need, they don't fight on the color of their skin, they don't use excess violence than is necessary for their survival and so on and so forth, right? We do it, and yet we call them human values, where actually I think animal values are perhaps more closer to what you refer to as human.
I think, Aditya preempted what I was trying to ask you. He's done it in a more trenchant manner than I could do it, but I do want to ask you, what is the individual agency when it comes to personal agency in adapting oneself to the whole notion of human rights? Because the Yadavs became more aggressive after getting to be more wealthy. Similarly, the Jats, and once upon a time, not too much in the distant past, they were, if not recipients of the same kind of violations of the human rights as Dalits, they were still on the receiving end of some kind of violation. Then, a certain section, though a small section of Dalits, got co-opted into the power elite, like Mayavati and her co-ops, and yet the larger sections of the Dalits were still, their human rights were violated and continue to be violated. So, what happens to one's personal agency? Is it just because it's a collective behavior, or is it a freedom from any restrictions of a human right-related behavior which allows you to transcend those boundaries?
I was just asking the relationship between the domestic legal framework and the international legal framework, and whether using the UN forums would only play a standard-setting exercise or really shift the way we look at these issues domestically.
And of course, there's the additional factor that the big superpower of the world refuses to make itself in any way respondent to these. So there is an issue there of geopolitics.
There are different terms are being used. We talk about human rights, constitutional rights, fundamental rights, basic rights, second, third generation rights, and things. So broadly, I think we need to take. And I think since the 90s, we find there is some type of a proliferation of rights talk. And I think Upendra Bakshi, in one of his papers, recent papers, says that there is an increasing tendency to translate basic human needs into human rights or rights type of thing. Whether it is right to food or other type of things, any basic human.
That's the question.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that it also, the issue is that the rights issue comes up when the state in its routine work fails to deliver certain things.
Yes.
So I think one of the things is that probably how do you make the state work, which is supposed to do. The other thing is that very often it happens that it also brings in the coercive power of the state. It's not only a right that the human being is supposed to get certain right, it also gives certain punitive, and this is now coming into discussion about right to water and sanitation. For example, if you say right to sanitation, it also means something about open defecation. Does the state has a right to put people who do open defecation into jails? No, I think this is a double-edged type of a thing. So we need to see coercive, punitive realm of the state doesn't come into play when we talk about some of these.
Well, I would put it another way, which is interesting because that has not come up at all in this whole discussion. Where are duties? And what you just said is classic example of that. How can you have sanitation as a right if you're not exercising it as a duty also? And by the way, there's a very interesting talk given by Soli Sorabji in Bombay very recently, about a year ago, after this new government came into power and after some of the early examples of intolerance were that, and he said this, that in an absence of a public discourse on duties, we should not expect our claims on rights to carry any power.
No, when we are talking about human rights violation, it's the flip side of use or rather misuse of power. So at a philosophical level, can we dream of a power-free society? Is what I'm asking. And then can we develop a positive connotation of power, if at all?
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. That's what 10, 11 questions, which is possible in 5 minutes. But let me just
Respond to the sense.
the sense of it is that I think we have to think, and Aditya, I think this comes to your question, what is human about human rights is the basic fundamental principle that we are trying to uphold the dignity of everyone. The dignity of everyone should not be assaulted or impacted in any way. And the second very powerful message of the human rights paradigm, and this came not only from the UN, it came from long before, including Gandhiji's talisman, is that if you subscribe to the human rights instruments or standards or values or whatever, you have to meet the needs of the most vulnerable first. And that's what we have not done. Our laws and policies are not based on, whether you look at economic policy or how do you start, making a policy? So how do you meet the needs of the most vulnerable first? And the second point is that if of course there's a whole question of, duties and responsibilities, and there is an assumption there that everyone has to realize what harm they're doing to others, and what is their responsibility to uphold other people's human rights. And that's where we need a society, and I think somebody mentioned this whole sort of education system, human rights education system, which teaches everybody what rights are and how you have to respect other people. That's in our values as well. So, and the third general point I would make is that I don't think we should get stuck on this law or that UN's body or that. The principal value that I found working on human rights in many different countries in the world is that it gives you the context and the space and very often the standards to have mobilization. You can mobilize a lot of people, whether it's on the right to food or like the National Campaign Dalit Human Rights has done on the rights of Dalits, or women's rights groups in this country have done on women and violence, that it gives you that context to mobilize people, including at the grassroots level. So it's not only UCL, PUDR. The other thing it does is that it gives you the right to defend yourself. This whole issue of human rights defenders, people who are using the Right to Information Act, people who are defending their land rights, they have an agency in a sense to say, we are human beings and we are defending our rights and we are defending the rights of others, what's happening right now in JNU, right? And you don't have to get into values and religion and all. You're essentially defending the dignity of people. And I think, when we think of the UN in that context, it's not only, we have to get away from this idea that it's a intergovernmental system. It's actually not. There's a very large part of the UN which is composed of independent experts, independent bodies that are, largely free from government interference.
Now, ILO, WHO, by
and in these bodies that I'm talking about, whether it's, let's say, the Committee on Rights of the Child or the Committee on, against discrimination against women, people, including many groups from India, are presenting reports, giving an alternative scenario, challenging the state, exposing violations, and many of those come back as recommendations. And I think this is where also the conception that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, I think Wasim was saying that the development of human rights didn't stop there. That was just the beginning. We've had decades of development on children's rights, women's rights, indigenous rights. Indigenous groups, tribal groups from around the world have used the UN framework to fight for their rights, to challenge their state, to actually say that we are not even bound by the boundaries of the state. We have our own rights to self-determination. So I think that, I mean, ultimately it's, my father a long time ago wrote this very moving piece called Human Rights Movement in Search of a Theory. And I think that that's essentially what we need, is we need to bring, I think what you're saying, all of these strands together and say, so what is the theory? And of course that theory has to be based on what we've all been talking about the last few days, is the practice on the ground. The theory has to come from the type of examples that Nyango was giving the others. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Before I hand over to Ashish, I just want to share a piece of information that the National Human Rights Commission, apart from being mandated by the Parliament, I mean, it's a constitutional body, it's a statutory body, to take complaints, it is also required to raise human rights awareness across the country. And I discovered only in the last 2 years that they do this, because I've been invited twice by them. And they are doing it by primarily through holding seminars and workshops in law colleges across the country. And so you get this captive audience of 200 young law students. And I think some of us should really make a conscious effort. I mean, I don't know how I got on their list. I'm very so I never say no matter where it is. Twice I've gone. And I think we should make an effort to work with that process. Because these institutions will now depend on our, what shall we say, pull and push to keep them active and dynamic. Thank you so much for a wonderful session, and back to